Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I am Matthew McQuilla, and I'm here with Professor Larry Catá. Today, we are here to discuss his book in Chapter 9, Thoughts on Violent Popular Mob Action Against the Solid Virtues of Prosperity and Stability by Professor Chen. How are you doing, Professor Backer?
Very well, very well. It's nice to see you again.
It's nice to see you as well. We don't get to see each other as often, you know?
It's the problem with COVID. It's like my hair. Everything changes. I used to have very short hair until COVID.
Well, now your short hair is transferred to your beard, I see.
Yes.
I guess that's what happens when you write an entertaining book. You're stuck down there putting your thoughts in pen to paper. So tell us a little bit about this chapter.
All right.
What did you hope to reach within this letter or documentation at this time, August 9th of 2019?
All right. Well, during the course of the event, I had taken Professor Chen's writing very, very seriously. He is one of the great lights of the Hong Kong academic community, internationally known, very sensitive, and always thoughtful and thought-provoking. And as you recall, in chapter 6 was my first engagement with some of his initial thoughts on what really surprising to everyone by that point was the state of the situation in Hong Kong. And there, the focus was on attempting to figure out how to engage in a rational discourse, which required bringing both the emotive physicality of the people on the streets together with the far more cerebral and discursive responses of the local and central authorities in a way that and we discussed a little bit how that presented some challenges, especially for the people who are trying to do this, like Professor Chen, who is stuck in the middle of a context in which probably engagement, that kind of constructive, as he might have referred to, a Habermasian engagement was not in the cards. With this one, Professor Chen, I think, responds to what I found to be a very interesting, at this point, we're still in the, we're heading into the second week of August. What I thought was at the time, a very peculiar, but in retrospect, a very powerful discursive trope that is developed by the central authorities and here picked up by Professor Chen. And that is the trope of stability and prosperity as the fundamental premises on which the two-system model must be grounded. Now, at the time, of course, and I keep saying this is early in what winds up being a year-long transformation. At the time, I thought, oh, prosperity and stability, okay, that kind of makes sense. I'm surprised it took them this long to do it. It's tied to Marxist-Leninist notions of privileging economic, social, and cultural rights over civil and political rights. And here we've got the constellation of Hong Kong protesters relying increasingly on the protection of international civil and political rights. So of course, discursively, it makes sense to move where the socialist camp had been moving since the 1970s. This isn't, of course, the Russian version. It is a much, much more sophisticated Chinese version of it, and the expression and the condensation of that expression into these two principles, I thought was, well, intriguing, right? Prosperity and stability. You need a quiet space within which one can create economic and therefore cultural and social rights, which then are the foundation for the political expression, the purpose of which, because this is a circle, the purpose of which is to further the stability necessary for greater prosperity. There's, for students of Chinese Marxist-Leninist theory, of course, this makes perfect sense in the context of the historical development undertaken by the vanguard leading the nation towards the perfection of its economic, social, and cultural systems, and ultimately to the establishment of a communist society off in China. Right. So that's what we saw. That's what I saw, and but it was most interesting here because it wasn't the central authorities who are speaking about this here in this context. It's being picked up by Professor Chen. Now, of course, he's not inventing this. He's picking this up from the dialogue, and I use the dialogue term very broadly because it's this kind of dialogue, physical bodies of protesters dialoguing this way, local and state officials dialoguing this way. So and there is the Hong Kong academic community in the middle, kind of saying, no, maybe we can, do something like this. And that's really what is going on here. And there was a substantial appeal, certainly within the second week of August. Wow, okay, it's now been 2 months. It's the 9th of August. It starts on the 9th of June. Wow, maybe this is something that will work. And then you read through it, and something actually quite different emerges.
So do they see two different points in which there is stability or directions that lead to a better place of stability and prosperity between the two camps?
Well, if you think about it, here what the central authorities by putting out there as the bedrock concept, stability and prosperity, there are a number of it's a really nicely dense way of describing their position. Stability, on the one hand, is an indictment of the methods by which the Hong Kong protesters are exercising their political and civil rights on the streets, disruptive, causing a police response which leads to violence. Right. Again, this is from the government's perspective. From the protesters' perspective, it's going to look completely different. There, you're looking at the impossibility of stability in the face of a government that has effectively ignored or breached its own ideological responsibilities to its people, and then is deaf to them, so that the only expressive means of communication is to get on the street, right? And here's where you've got this, and then the discussion goes like this. So the central authorities are talking about stability in one context, which looks at the people on the street and the consequential disruption and violence as the thing that will be destructive of society. And then the protesters are looking at it from the other way, saying that in fact, it is the intransigence and unwillingness of those state authorities to do what they're supposed to do, a kind of passive violence, that then causes this to happen. And so the instability is coming not from the actions on the street, which is seeking to create or preserve their ideal of stability, but it's really coming from the intransigence of the central authorities. So that's where you get this. All right, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, right, and again, this is from the central authority, stability also suggests the necessary calm that is absolutely central to fixing or enhancing the lives, including the political and civil rights lives of people, by creating an atmosphere in which individuals can maximize their engagement in productive society. And that again also goes back to the Marxist-Leninist, Chinese Marxist-Leninist notions here of the development of productive forces as a central element in the purpose, right, and the responsibility of a state. And so you're looking at this both as an indictment of the protesters and as the necessary basis on which social organization is founded so that the state can continue to exist legitimately and authoritatively, right? And then you connect that
Mhm.
the notions of prosperity, which is consequential, which is, in fact, in the absence of stability, where you have chaos or disorder, right, where you have those kinds of things, then prosperity becomes more elusive. And in the absence of prosperity, a person who is starving to death is hardly in a position to exercise political and civil rights. This is an old notion, and you can trace this back to debates that were going on in the late 1960s, early 1970s, between the Soviet camp and the Western camp with respect to the two international covenants. But it comes out here again, but it also anchors and underlines the central government's approach, or their discursive foundation, which is that indeed the principal value of two systems is to create a context specific space where that kind of prosperity can be enhanced and further developed. And so you've got this very simple and straightforward thing: stability, which is a necessary requisite for prosperity, which is what, and this is again the line that Professor Chen picks up, which is what both the constellation of protesters and the central government want. So that's the point of commonality, right? Which then takes us back to the notion, aha, maybe in the notions of stability and prosperity, we found a common space where people can rationally communicate, right? Which is the object of this thing. And that will ratchet down the violence and ratchet down the violence of the response, the central authorities' response, and maybe something can come of that, right? And that's kind of the framework in which one sees this developing. And at that point, of course, Professor Chen then applies a series of logical arguments. If in fact, right, that may be the common basis that everyone wants in one form or another, stability and prosperity, then doesn't make any sense. And it is clear that the central authorities are not going to want any more than that. Does it make any kind of rational sense? Again, bringing back in this notion of rationality. Does it make any kind of rational sense to continue on the path that they are continuing when the possibility of actually achieving something beyond that is going to be costly, to say the least? And of course, at this point, we've got, this is where the great challenge comes in a couple of respects. The first is one makes the assumption that stability and prosperity are terms, the meanings of which are shared in equal measure by the protesting groups and by the central and local authorities. And it wasn't clear to me, even back in August, that we have a coherent, singular space for meaning of either stability or of prosperity. And of course, if in fact your key terms are terms that are themselves contested, then it becomes very difficult to find the common space. And I think even by this point, stability for the protesting groups was already beginning to look somewhat different than stability from the perspective of the central and local authorities. Stability for the protesting groups was in part a function of respect for the civil and political traditions that they found in Hong Kong, civil and political traditions that the central authorities did not value very much. And that goes back to some of the discussions that I referred back to in chapter 2, right? And then for the central authorities, stability requires a adherence to law and lawfulness, to the rhythms and rules through which the state can maintain order, right? And so two very different modes of stability. Prosperity is also potentially viewed in different ways. How do you measure? How do you recognize prosperity? Is it, and this is, of course, an argument that we have in very different ways in the liberal democratic camp, and that is, how do you judge effectively, or how do you measure? How do you recognize the components of popular welfare? And here again, it was clear by this point that there was a value added to abstract concepts within at least certain factions of the protesting constellation, which would have been unaccepted or not incomprehensible, because they comprehended it quite well, but rejected by the central authority. So you've got that problem. And then the second problem, of course, that you have is that, in fact, if you take this formulation as it's given, it suggests that stability and prosperity, even assuming that you can find a common meaning for both, are valued to the same extent by both the people on the street and by the local and central authorities. And I think that was a part of the problem. Logically, the argument here is elegant, and it's quite beautiful and compelling. The problem is the challenges that are posed by both the issue of meaning, the perspective-based issue of meaning, and then ultimately by the valuation itself. And it becomes, I think, very clear by this point that we've got a dissonance in valuation for the state, for the central authorities. Stability and prosperity marked by order and economic augmentation of welfare takes pride of place. It's not clear that those are the two things that chunks, large and perhaps influential chunks of the protesting movement valued in the same way or to the same extent. And so that's what makes this, it's a little jewel of a chapter, but that's what makes the chapter kind of interesting. And again, a pivot chapter like chapter 8, we're assessing again, and we're seeing how we're at this point where you begin to see that where we are by August 9th is in a very different place conceptually, in terms of stakes, in terms of conceptions and self-conceptions of what is actually going on than we were on the 9th of June.
Well, one final question that I would have is, how was this writing received by observers and onlookers and other academics who are in the West or in other parts of the world, not in Hong Kong?
Well, it's difficult to say. I did not take a straw poll. From my absolutely skewed and not neutral analysis, that is, in talking to the people I know, if we happen to be talking about this at the time. And again, lots of other things are going on in August of 2019. So this is in our consciousness, but there are all kinds of other things going on as well that are taking everyone's attention, especially in the West, not in Hong Kong, but especially in the West.
Yeah. And
so for a lot of people, I think still at this time, there's ideological gut feelings will move them in particular directions. I'm being deliberately vague, but again, the way you approach this and the way you thought about this by August would depend on your ideological starting point, which would be very different, for example, for elite Western constitutional intellectuals than it might have been for intellectuals who may be in developing countries but not in Asia. Different for Asians, and certainly different depending on where and who you were in China. still a sense that the thing was containable, quote unquote, that there was, that resolution was possible. And that, in a sense, I think underlies the motivation for writing this, but also a sense here that that window may not exist for long, and even by this point, there's going to be a price, right? And so if you are ideologically sympathetic, and again, there'll be several camps. Here's three that I identify with. If you're ideologically sympathetic to notions of sovereignty, you come from developing states, you privilege the sensitivity to the effects, the lingering structural effects of decolonization and then post-colonialism, then the notions of Chinese sovereignty, the sovereignty discussions may flavor the way in which you hear these things and value them, and how you may want to come out.
Okay.
If you are a liberal democratic, human rights oriented, Western intellectual that privileges human rights and its political and associative expressions, especially as against an autonomous set of governmental actors, then you might tend to be more sympathetic to positions that you see developing on the ground. Again, there's no discourse yet on the ground that is the equal to the discourse that's already beginning to be developed by the central authorities, but you might be more interested in that. And if you are an intellectual or someone else who views the integrity of global economics within systems of order, then you might tend to take a different view as well. Understand that at this point, even though the Americans took a very different view by the end of President Trump's term in office, and then at the beginning of President Biden's, are we there yet? Yes, I think the time.
Are you talking about within the book?
Well, no. During the book, we're dealing with the Trump administration, and then it's picked up later by the Biden administration.
Yes.
At least initially, it was my understanding that the U.S. administration and its influencers were to some extent divided. Mr. Trump had been known to have made expressions of solidarity with the sovereignty principle along the lines of it's their territory. As much as we may not like it, they can do what they like. The same with us and I was going to say our commonwealths or our states. But at the same time, there was already a beginning of push among influencers and political elites that begin to worry about this from the perspective of human rights. And another group that was worried about this from the perspective of the economic challenges that we're already facing in the relations between China and the United States in particular, but the West in general. So crazy time.
A crazy time it was. But I'm sure that we will see what the next moves will be and whether or not these statements or the statements that you made about the statements by Professor Chen are going to be held to be correct in the next upcoming chapters. We have finally made it out of the single digit chapters. You feeling better about it?
I am. We got a little ways to go, but it was a long year. And we were privileged to be on the sidelines, much worse to have been
on the field
in terms of the intensity to have been an actual participant. So,
well, I appreciate you for spending your time with me again today, and I appreciate everyone for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that you will enjoy reading the book eventually.
That's right. And as and when you have questions or you want to engage, we are delighted to to create a space where we can talk.
All right.
All
Well,
right. Thank you again.
all right, you're welcome. Have a nice day.